Thank you to all of you for being here. Wow, we've got a huge number who have already logged in. I'm really excited to jump into the data here. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Nathaniel Stinnett. I'm the founder and executive director of the Environmental Voter Project. And this is our no hot takes election analysis of the 2025 November elections. This is what you've got coming up. First, I am going to give a very brief overview. I mean, really brief overview of what we do at the Environmental Voter Project. I apologize ahead of time for those of you who aren't familiar with our work. This is not a webinar where we're going to go into exhaustive detail about what we do at EVP. Instead, we're going to jump into a really nerdy, no hot takes election analysis, okay? So after we do that overview of EVP, we're going to set the stage, just go over briefly what happened in some of the bigger elections. Then we're going to dive into whether there's any data showing that certain types of voters are changing their minds about issues, politicians, or political parties. Then we're going to move more into voter turnout. Who showed up? Who didn't show up? What does that mean now and for the future? Fifth, we're going to talk about climate change and climate messaging. We are an environmental organization. We know that many of you are climate and environmental activists, and there is some relevant data around the political salience of climate change and some messaging. Then we're going to get into some of our plans for next year. Yes, we are already mobilizing voters again, and there are ways for you to get involved in 2026. Finally, this will be lots of data today. There will be an optional Q&A for when it's over. Some of you, once you've gotten through all this data, might say, you know what, that's enough for me. I don't want to stick around for a longer Q&A. But if you want to, we are going to be here for you answering all of your questions. And as Shannon mentioned previously, as we go along, if you have questions, please put them in that Q&A folder. Shannon will either answer your question or she will hold it for me for this Q&A at the end. So without further ado, let's jump into stuff. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Environmental Voter Project, we're a nonpartisan nonprofit that is laser focused on identifying people who care deeply about climate and the environment, yet they don't vote. And we do this because we don't want to be in the mind-changing business. We don't want to try to convince people to care about something that they don't currently care about. That's important, but it's really hard and really expensive. Instead, we want to focus on finding the people who don't need their minds changed. They just need their behavior changed. They need to turn from non-voters into voters. And we do that because it's cheaper, it's easier. You can test your messaging and prove what works and what doesn't work. And it turns out there are millions and millions of these non-voting environmentalists. How we do it is a four-step process. First is we work with data scientists to build what's called predictive models. It enables us to individually identify, so I really mean that, on an individual basis, we can identify voters who are very likely to list climate as their number one priority, but we can see in public voter files that they're not voting. That allows us to move to step two, mobilization. When we've identified these people who don't need their minds changed, they just need their behavior changed, well then, we have the luxury of being completely agnostic with our messaging. We don't even need to talk about climate change. We can just focus on what behavioral science tells us is the best way to change these people's behavior. So we work with now over 7,000 volunteers to canvass, call, and send postcards to these environmentalists. We as a staff also do direct mail and digital ad campaigns focused on one thing and one thing only, and that is turning non-voters into new voters and new voters into consistent voters, so we can build the political power of the climate movement. Step three, habit reinforcement. If you're trying to build that political power, you can't just parachute into certain districts once every 2 years and talk to these voters and assume that their voting habits are going to change. No, you need to talk to them over and over again. So we truly do work year round. We have already mobilized voters for 2 different elections just since November 4th. And as you'll see towards the end of this webinar, we've got 3 or 4 more elections just coming up over the next 3 or 4 weeks. All told, we're going to end up being active in over 450 elections in 2025. That's how seriously we take this habit reinforcement, because ultimately our goal is step four, and that is to change the electorate. We know that politicians go where the votes are because nothing motivates them more than the prospect of winning or losing elections. And so our goal is to just flood the electorate with climate first voters. What we know is that over this past year, we were active in 21 different states. These are the 21 states where we work, and we targeted almost 4.2 million voters. And we can tell from public voter files heading into Election Day that almost 900,000 of these voters we were targeting voted early, which is pretty extraordinary considering that we only target people who are unlikely to vote. They're not supposed to show up. And as you can see in some of these elections, like Des Moines and Gainesville and some of the New Hampshire elections, early voting data wasn't even available yet. So this number is probably even higher than that. But what's really unique about the Environmental Voter Project is we don't take credit for numbers like this. We don't assume that just because we communicated with someone, even if it was someone who wasn't supposed to vote, and then they ended up voting, that change happened because of us. We know there are other groups out there. We know there are other external factors going on that could change people's voting behavior. And so we take a really scientifically rigorous approach to this and run what's called randomized control trials. Very briefly, what that means is, let's say we are targeting 500,000 people in Pennsylvania. What we don't do is immediately start communicating with all 500,000 of them. Instead, we randomly separate them into two groups, one of which is a control group that we set aside and we never talk to. Then the remaining treatment group, which is usually about 80% of that original universe, they're the ones who we send all this behavioral science informed messaging to. We canvass and call and mail and send them digital ads. Then Election Day happens. And then a few months later, because whether you vote or not is public record, we can compare how many of the unlikely environmental voters we targeted voted to how many voted in our control group. And by doing this, we can control for all outside factors and isolate what our sole impact was on turnout. This is the type of results that we report back to our donors and our volunteers. We don't have those for you yet because we still need to wait a few more months for those voter files to be updated. But boy, do we look forward to reporting back to you on that stuff. All right, that's all I got for the intro to EVP. Now let's dive into our no hot takes election analysis. First, I just want to say, obviously we have this like cutesy name, no hot takes. This is what you have coming to you over the next 45 minutes or so. We are going to lean in to nuance. We are going to call out what we know and what we don't know. We are going to have a very, very healthy dose of so-called Socratic ignorance, which is the frank acknowledgement of what we don't know. Because only when you acknowledge what you don't know are you able to access wisdom, but also really lean into researching what you need to research and digging into what really needs to be understood better. So there aren't going to be any hot takes, and we're not going to give you easy answers. We're going to give you a lot of hard answers. If you want easy answers, you're in the wrong place. Go watch some pundits on TV. Okay, let's dive into the data here. As many of you know, in Virginia, the Democratic gubernatorial candidate, Abigail Spanberger, won by 15.2 percentage points. You can see that's a huge swing from 8 years ago in Virginia and an enormous swing from 4 years ago in Virginia. New Jersey also had a really, really big jump. Not only back to where Phil Murphy was 8 years ago in New Jersey, when he won his first term as a Democratic governor, but even slightly beyond that. Democrats really, really won big in these two high turnout gubernatorial elections. Moreover, in some of the other statewide elections that happened, like Pennsylvania, and you see X's there because we really don't have appropriate baseline elections to compare November 4th to, but a huge, huge result And this is an average of what the three state Supreme Court retention election margins were. And in the Georgia Public Service Commission races, those two races averaged out was a 25.7 point Democratic margin. And again, we don't have a great baseline to compare that to, which is why you have those X's. Now, obviously, there were a whole bunch of other elections that happened. We're going to talk about some of those other elections today, but we're not going to talk about others for a few reasons. One, it's just too much to get into. Two, partisan elections have a lot more relevant data when we're trying to dig into what this might mean for the midterms and the presidentials than nonpartisan elections. And three, we work in some states and we don't work in others, which means we have much more data because we have access to public voter files in some states as opposed to others. So as an example, we're not going to be talking much about California's Prop 50 ballot measure. That's not because we can't learn from it, and it's certainly not because it wasn't important. But as a nonpartisan election and as a state where we, the Environmental Voter Project, don't work, we had access to slightly less data for that. All right, let's jump in to how much movement, how consistent this movement was in each of these states. First, I want to call out where we got this graph from. Most of the graphs and charts we present to you are going to be ones we built. This one isn't. This is from a really great Substack, and we're going to put a link to it in the chat, called Strength in Numbers, run by G. Elliott Morris. He was the head data journalist at The Economist and then at 538.com, and now has his own Substack, Strength in Numbers. I really encourage you all to subscribe to it. I have no horse in this race other than I think I know a lot about like political data, and G. Elliott Morris is really friggin' good at this stuff. So subscribe to that Substack. All right, what this shows is in these four states, so you can see the colors up here, Georgia, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Virginia are all different colors. And you can see they had varying margins from the baseline in 2024. So this black diagonal line here represents the baseline we're working with, which is what was the Kamala Harris versus Donald Trump margin in those states. That's the baseline. And you'll see, not only in each of these states did Democrats do better, as we just described, but look at all these circles. What those circles are every county in those states. So the red circles are Georgia counties. The blue circles are New Jersey counties. If it's a big circle, it's a county with a huge population. If it's a small circle, it's a county with a much smaller population. And look, pretty much every single county, whether it was big, whether it was small, whether Kamala Harris won it by a lot or Donald Trump won it by a lot, almost every single one of them moved towards the Democrats. This was a really consistent, deep, and broad Democratic victory. Okay. Knowing that, what does it mean? You have probably already heard a whole bunch of pundits make, I think, fairly irresponsible hot takes talking about how, this means that this group is swinging back to Democrats. Young people are swinging back, or black voters are swinging back, or Hispanics are swinging back, or this, that, or the other thing. Man, is there a lot that we don't know simply by looking at even really sophisticated granular data like this. And so a lot of what I'm going to spend the next 30 minutes doing is teasing out this big top line data for you into what we know and what we don't know, what it might mean, what it probably doesn't mean. Again, you're in a place for nerds here. There's going to be a lot of nuance, and we're going to embrace what we know and especially what we don't know here. All right. So first, let's talk about persuasion. Let's talk about mind changing. Did some voters change their minds about issues or specific politicians or political parties? When having a discussion like this, it is always important to remember a few things. First, different election cycles don't just have different politicians at different like spots on the calendar. They also have different sizes, not just of turnout, but of the subgroups within that larger or smaller turnout. And yes, even when we look at demographic subgroups, they have lots of different individual voters. I mean, I know we all know this, but we're not used to talking about politics in this way. There aren't only like 10 archetypes of voter out there that everybody fits into. And we all know that like not every Hispanic male is the same, and not every Asian American and Pacific Islander grandmother is the same. But oh my God, is it really important to remember that? Because these are the types of really difficult, nuanced issues we need to hold on to when we're trying to talk about are people changing their minds. Okay. We did see a lot of big demographic swings. So, first, we're going to look at two very different elections. Remember, a 2024 presidential election is very different from a 25 gubernatorial. And as an example here, we're going to take the New Jersey gubernatorial election that just happened and look at some of the demographic swings that we saw. But remember, you need to bear in mind hugely different turnout, different groups of people, different individuals. Okay, with that enormous caveat, what are some swings? Well, big swing among black men. Kamala Harris won black men in New Jersey by 49 points. Mikey Sherrill just won them by 85 points. Big, big demographic swing. Hispanic women, a 32-point swing towards Democrats. Younger voters, 18 to 29, 32-point swing. Now, this is just in New Jersey, but we saw similar things in Virginia. 30 to 44-year-olds, again, big, big swing. Something that has not been reported is a swing the other way among voters 65 and up. Harris won them by 12 points. Mikey Sherrill only won them by 3. Abigail Spanberger won them by a bit more than this. Now, again, I don't think you should look at this and start worrying if you're a Democrat saying like, oh, we're losing people over 65 years old. No. Demographic swings aren't necessarily evidence of swing voters, of people changing their minds. Because we need to remember that these are different electorates made up of different subgroups of voters, made up of different individuals. And just as an illustration of that, if we look at New Jersey in 2024, 4.3 million people cast ballots, an election that Kamala Harris won by 5.9 percentage points in New Jersey. The election that just happened a week and a half ago, or I guess it's about 2 weeks ago, not even 3.3 million. So it had voted. So it was about 75% of last year's turnout. And so a really dramatically different group of people. And so it's really important to, again, bear in mind that demographic swings across different in-kind elections, so presidentials to gubernatorials or gubernatorials to next year's midterms, doesn't necessarily mean that there are individuals changing their minds. We dug a little bit deeper, though, to see if we can find some evidence of individuals changing their minds. But you're warned now when you see pundits talking about like shifts of huge, big demographic groups from last year. Oh my God, that does not mean that Hispanic women moved 32 points towards Democrats. It just doesn't. Many of us might wish that, but that's not what it means. All right. So, were there some real swing voters? Yes. Yes. We did see some evidence of that. So, if you look at exit polling data, one of the questions in states like Virginia and New Jersey was, who did you vote for in 2024? So, as with all polls, you need to take with a grain of salt how people answer any question, but especially how they voted a year ago. Because believe it or not, some people forget, and believe it or not, more people lie. But What we saw in Virginia was that 99% of the people who said they voted for Kamala Harris a year ago voted for Abigail Spanberger this year. So only 1% of Kamala Harris voters changed their mind, swung, and voted for Winsome Earl Sears, the Republican candidate for governor in Virginia. But what happened with people who voted for Donald Trump a year ago in Virginia? They were much swingier. Only 93% of them voted Republican for governor. 7%, not a small number, 7% of self-acknowledged, self-admitted Donald Trump voters voted for Democrat Abigail Spanberger. That's real swinginess. That's real swinginess. That's I freely I'll make up that word. That's real swinginess. Let's look at New Jersey. Pretty much the same picture. 97% of Kamala Harris voters in New Jersey voted for the Democrat Mikey Sherrill. 3% of them swung to Republicans and voted for Chitterelli. Again, though, 7% of Donald Trump voters voted for Mikey Sherrill. So again, yes, there were some swing voters. There absolutely were some people who changed their mind. Not nearly as many as you might assume if you just look at big demographic shifts, but 7% is not a small number. There were some people who voted for Donald Trump and voted for the Democrat for governor. You can obviously argue whether that means changing minds. Certainly, these people might vote for Republicans in other elections. Maybe they voted for other Republicans on the same ballot. But this is still some swinginess. It's still some swinginess. Some other interesting stuff that we saw was when we looked at Hispanic voters. We didn't see this when you look at just big percentages. Oftentimes, looking at percentages, which is what most people do in elections, can be a little misleading. If you look at percentages, again in New Jersey, because New Jersey is a little bit more racially diverse, so there's a little bit larger sample sizes when you're looking at things like how Hispanic voters moved and things like that. In majority Hispanic towns, yeah, there was some movement from 2020 to 2024. Majority Hispanic towns moved pretty dramatically towards Trump in New Jersey. From 2021 to 2025, the movement actually wasn't as much. All right. But when we look at some of the raw vote tallies, shocking, I know nobody looks at raw vote tallies. We love looking at raw vote tallies because you can discover some really interesting nuggets here. And so we looked at Union City, New Jersey. There's a decent sized population. And so you've got lots of people voting, even in gubernatorial elections, about 15, 16,000 people. And it is 82% Hispanic. And what's really interesting here is, look, a year ago, in a high turnout presidential election, Kamala Harris got 11,300 votes. A few weeks ago, in a lower turnout gubernatorial election, Mikey Sherrill beat Kamala Harris's raw vote tally. It's pretty hard to look at data like that and think it's solely due to differences in turnout. That would be pretty hard. Yes, possible, but extraordinarily unlikely. What is almost definitely going on here was that people were changing their minds. That there were a whole lot of voters, likely Hispanic voters, this is an 82% Hispanic city, who voted for Trump and then voted for Mikey Sherrill, because Mikey Sherrill got 2,000 more votes, more raw votes than Kamala Harris did a year ago in a much higher turnout election. We think this is some really compelling evidence that, yes, in this election, there were some Hispanic voters who voted Donald Trump and then voted Mikey Sherrill. Can we extrapolate from that to look at Florida in the midterms or Texas in the midterms? Dear God, no. But it is interesting, actionable intelligence that should lead smart people in smart campaigns to start wondering, okay, What messaging was working with these particular voters, and how can we start testing that in 2026 to try to replicate some of these results? Oh, and as I say there, much more suggestive of swinginess, my new favorite word, swinginess. Okay, so if there was some evidence of minds being changed, how did it happen? This is something that I'm sorry you're going to hear a whole lot of people with lots of burning hot takes saying, oh, it's because of this, it's because of that. We just don't know. There are too many variables. If someone tells you, oh, it's because these, moderate women from the suburbs, cleaned up and that's what Democrats need to do. Sorry, no. If you think, oh, well, we all need to be charismatic, progressive, democratic socialists, like, I'm sorry, no. If you think it means we need to talk about X, Y, or Z, like, no, there are just too many variables involved. There are too many variables involved. And what I'd like to do is just dig into exactly how ignorant all of us are of why and how minds were changed in an election like this. Because again, I think it will help us think much more intelligently about communicating with voters. And I know that we have lots of campaign and nonprofit staff and activists and donors on the line here. So you signed up for a nerdy no hot takes analysis, and this is what you're getting. There's a whole lot of nuance. We are used to talking about candidates and elections along a two-dimensional, or really a one-dimensional axis, sort of a line here. And it's an ideological spectrum, liberal to conservative. And hopefully you just try to get the right balance or the right spot on that spectrum, and then you unlock the electorate with a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And I'm sorry, there are just far more important, strong variables at play here. More and more, we are seeing Trump Bernie voters, Trump Bernie Sanders voters, or Trump Mamdani voters. And there's a lot of reason to believe that people don't just place themselves along an ideological spectrum, they place themselves along an establishment versus anti-establishment spectrum. Moreover, they view that establishment versus anti-establishment spot sometimes as being cultural, sometimes as being economic, sometimes as being political. Beyond that, we saw a lot of evidence from 2024 that one of the most dramatic ways to separate the electorate was based on a spectrum of political awareness. How politically aware or attuned to what's going on in the world are people? Do they only hear about a candidate when they hear them on a podcast, or they make a bawdy joke, or they show up on Dancing on the Stars? Well, they are going to think about all of these issues very, very differently than people who consume political media on a regular basis. These are all axes upon which people's minds get changed. As a perfect example of this, I promise you, there are a whole lot of people who know nothing about Donald Trump's political views, but they are paying attention to little things like him knocking down part of the White House or the Epstein files or things like that. Moreover, there are a lot of really other important variables here. Donald Trump has been the center of political gravity in all elections for almost a decade now. There is issue salience. What issues are important to you? What just happened in your neighborhood? There are broader economic trends. Lower high employment, lower high inflation. There is incumbency and anti-incumbency. There is a candidate's race. There is a candidate's gender. All of these things come together in a stew that really makes it hard to look at an election result and say something like, oh, I told you we should run more candidates like this. So many different stuff is at play. So many different things are at play. But there are one or two things that I think we can be more certain about coming out of this election that just happened. The first is affordability is really top of mind for voters. Obviously, we don't have a counterfactual, right? We don't have a whole bunch of elections where nobody mentioned affordability to test this against. But it's pretty compelling that no matter what type of candidate you look like, no matter where you are on the ideological spectrum, no matter where it was on turnout, affordability was always top of mind in exit polling data. And we're looking at California, Virginia, New Jersey, and New York City because this is where there was good exit polling data, or this is actually where there was exit polling data. Now you'll see these are what voters, actual voters, listed as their single most important issue on November 4th. Now, these weren't open ended questions. They were given lists of issues to choose from, so that skews the responses. And as some of you might be noticing, the choices they were given were different in certain states, which makes it a little bit weird. But it's really hard to look at this data and not think, oh my God, everybody's thinking about affordability. Everybody's thinking about affordability. And so, yeah, I do think that that is a pretty certain takeaway from this election. Could that change? Of course it can change. We had an election 5 years ago that was about COVID. Things change. But at the moment, affordability is everything. A second thing that we can be fairly certain of is that Donald Trump is still the center of political discussion in any election that happens anywhere, even if you're running for dog catcher in Ketchikan, Alaska. And boy, is he unpopular. He is at his lowest approval rating of his second term. In some averages, this is an average of approval ratings taken from dozens and dozens of polls. In some individual polls, he's at his lowest approval rating ever, except for right after January 6th. So that's another thing that I think we can be fairly certain of in this world of our minds changing. All right, now let's talk about voter turnout. Now let's talk about voter turnout. Who voted? Why does it matter? And what might we be able to learn from this looking ahead? All right, New Jersey, the New Jersey gubernatorial election. As you'll see, and I alluded to this in a previous slide, boy, did turnout jump from 2021 to 2025. And you'll see the red are Republican votes, blue are Democratic votes, brown are other votes, third parties, fourth parties, fifth parties, write-ins, things like that. What I want to point out here is Chitterelli, the Republican candidate for governor, actually both in 2021 and 2025, he got so many votes this past, this past election that he would have won the election 4 years ago. His raw vote tally was enough to pretty much beat the pants off Phil Murphy 4 years ago. But turnout was so high, new voters, or at least new to gubernatorial election type voters, showed up in such dramatic numbers that Mikey Sherrill got almost 1.9 million votes. Mikey Sherrill got 550,000 more votes than Phil Murphy did 4 years ago when he won this election. A huge, huge jump in turnout. Let's turn to Virginia. Not as dramatic a boost in turnout, although still a pretty big boost in turnout. And again, I think it's important to recognize, even though Winsome Earl Sears, the Republican candidate for governor this year, was pretty unpopular, and even though she got not just less than both the Democrat, well, not only less than the Republican 4 years ago, but less than the Democrat 4 years ago. But what's really interesting is that Abigail Spanberger got so many votes that she wouldn't have just won 4 years ago when a Republican won in Virginia. She would have creamed him by 300,000 votes. Again, a huge, huge change in turnout. All right. New York City is particularly interesting. New York City almost doubled its mayoral election turnout from 4 years ago. Andrew Cuomo got so many votes, 855,000, that in any normal mayoral election year, he wouldn't have just won, he would have creamed his opponents. He would have creamed them. I think if 6 months ago you walked up to Andrew Cuomo and you said, in the November mayoral election, you're going to win 855,000 votes, he would have bet his house that he was going to end up mayor of New York. But that's because no one expected more than 2 million people to show up and vote. 2 million was a huge, huge jump in turnout. We're going to dig in to this data in particular because it really highlights how turnout isn't just one variable, big or medium or small, with the electorate always looking roughly the same here. If we look at who showed up based on vote propensity in the New York City mayoral election, it was a perfectly even 80-20 split. So 80% of those 2 million people who voted had voted in previous mayoral elections. 20% of 2 million is roughly 400,000. So a lot of people had never voted in a mayoral election before. Let's dig one step deeper. If we look at this 80-20 split, first let's look at the repeat mayoral voters. Those 1.6 million people who said that they had voted in previous mayoral elections, not all of them voted 4 years ago, many of them voted 8 years ago or 12 years ago. It was even. Mamdani only won by 2 percentage points. It was dead even. But of those 20%, of those 400,000 who said that they had never voted in a mayoral election before, Zohran Mamdani won them by a 2-1 margin. It's pretty much his entire winning margin is right here. 2-1 margin out of 400,000 new mayoral voters. That is pretty much how he won. It's about, what, 265,000 votes that he pulled ahead of Andrew Cuomo on among new mayoral voters. Who turns out is extraordinarily important when turnout goes up or down. So, many of you have heard, and I know this because you've reached out to me and asked me about it. Many of you have heard pundits saying, oh, okay, well, we've seen in special elections, Democrats doing really well. So, it's as simple as like low turnout is good for Democrats, right? No, it is not that simple. It is not that simple. You should not think about turnout the way that most pundits do, which is, and we've got a lot of nerdy charts and graphs in this presentation, but I will freely admit this is my favorite slide coming up here. This is not how turnout works. This is how turnout works. Turnout is not a big switch and it's either high or low or in the middle. You can individually target people, and not only can you individually target people, any campaign, even with a modicum of sophistication, knows how to individually target people who are likely or unlikely to vote for them. And so, no, it's not as simple as low turnout is good for this party or high turnout is good for that party. And we saw some of that in these results, and we can dig even further in the data and see some evidence of this. So let's look at Virginia, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Georgia, the 4 big statewide partisan elections. Obviously, there were other statewide elections, but they were either super sleepy or, like California, they weren't truly partisan. In Virginia and New Jersey, and you'll see 2024 here, that's the last presidential election. 2022 is the last midterm, or the light green is the last midterm, and the orange is the election that just happened. In Virginia and New Jersey, these gubernatorial elections that just happened, there is no intellectually honest way you can describe them as low turnout elections. In both Virginia and New Jersey, they were higher than midterm turnout. In New Jersey, significantly higher. The turnout that just happened in New Jersey was pretty much halfway between New Jersey's midterm turnout and their presidential level turnout. Maybe you call this a medium turnout election, but it's a pretty darn high turnout election. That's going to be higher than any other election you can think of, except for a presidential general. And Democrats cleaned up. It's not to say all high turnout elections work well for Democrats. It has to do with who shows up. And it's not just a big turnout switch. It's much more precise and nuanced than that. Now let's look at a low turnout election. And boy, was this low. Not just compared to presidentials or midterms. When you look at previous municipal elections in Georgia, usually for a mayoral election, you're seeing between 22 to 32% turnout in Georgia. So as an example, 4 years ago in the Atlanta mayoral, I think there was 25% turnout. This year in the Atlanta mayoral, I think there was 32% turnout. But in the statewide elections for the Public Service Commission election in Georgia, 19.5% of registered voters voted. And I should be clear about that. These turnout percentages that you're seeing are over a denominator of registered voters, not eligible voters, because usually you can get more precise numbers if you're measuring registered voters. So this was super low turnout. Yet again, Democrats just demolished Republicans. And so Democrats dominated regardless of turnout in this most recent election. They really, truly did. Don't believe someone who takes from these election results that like, okay, well, we know the Democrats do well in low turnout elections, but can they do well in higher turnout elections? Similarly, don't just assume that every high turnout election is the same and Democrats can just relax. No, it has to do with who turns out, because this is not how turnout works. This is how turnout works. All right. So what can we be fairly certain of on the turnout side of things? Changes in turnout can benefit either party. It's a multivariable system. And as I mentioned, across high and low turnout elections, we saw Democrats do well. We could see Republicans also do well, even though, yes, there are some demographic shifts going on in the partisan sort of outlook of the country. Second thing, yeah, demographic voting patterns are in flux. We look again just at New Jersey, and I alluded to this graph earlier. From 2020 to 24 to 25, if we just look at New Jersey, a lot of demographic groups are switching. We have some not applicable here because the sample size was too small in the 2020 New Jersey exit voter files to get good data on some of these subgroups. But what I'll just say is we have enough information about this to be uncertain. Okay? This is one of those examples of knowing enough to know that you don't know. And I don't mean to say that to frustrate you. I mean that to give you actionable intelligence. Maybe 10, 15 years ago, you could say, oh, voter registration efforts among young people will always help Democrats. Or high turnout among old people will always help Republicans. What I am suggesting to you is that don't read too much into the election that just happened when it comes to knowing how particular demographic groups act. Moreover, don't read too much into 2024 or 2020 when it comes to thinking we know how particular demographic groups will act. Really, in this instance, we only know enough to know that this is really uncertain. And maybe demography, at least now, is not destiny in politics. And we can never really have certainty, at least not in today's political environment, that broad demographic groups will do X or Y or Z. We just need to be more precise with our targeting. We absolutely do. All right, let's jump into climate change stuff. One thing that we can be fairly certain of and I'm sorry to bring you some bad news here, is that climate change is nowhere close to being a top tier political concern for voters right now. This is a chart that we've taken from the Economist YouGov. They do a weekly tracking poll. They ask a gazillion questions each week. And one of the questions they always ask of thousands of registered voters is, what's your number one most important political priority? In their most recent tracking poll, 5.2% listed climate change as their top concern. That is not an all-time low over the last 4 years, but it's close. It's about 4 years ago, it got as high as 17.2%, saying that climate change was their top priority. It doesn't do any of us in the climate movement any favors to ignore data like this. The simple truth is there are not enough climate first voters going to the polls right now. Period. End of sentence. And that needs to change. And I'm not just saying that because I run a voter turnout organization for the climate movement. Anybody needs to face up to the fact that we just don't have enough electoral power right now, and that needs to change. And what we saw 2 weeks ago doesn't change any of that. Okay. Another thing, though, is that voters overwhelmingly support government action on climate change. So it's not that salient, it's not that important, it's not a high priority for voters, but even though it's a lower priority for most people, when you ask them about it, even though it's a lower priority, boy, is action on climate really popular, even in a political context. And now I'm quoting a Yale program on climate change communications and George Mason data from a few months ago. And I'm not going to cite all of this data out loud. You can see it, but these are not lukewarm questions. 3/4 of registered voters in America want to regulate carbon dioxide as a pollutant. 59% say, yeah, build that solar farm in my backyard. 56% say, yeah, build that wind farm, not just 500 miles away, but in my backyard. 2/3 say we should completely transition from a fossil fuel economy to clean energy by 2050. These are not like, do you think it's important to buy more green products? These aren't questions that are easy to say yes to, yet a whole lot of voters are saying yes to them. So yeah, even though we've got bad news in this previous slide, it's also important to hold in that same space that action on climate, even political action on climate, is popular, even though it might not be salient. Another thing to take away from 2025 was that energy affordability was a big issue. You might hear a lot of people saying like, oh, no one's talking about climate in politics anymore. Well, those folks weren't paying attention. Climate was absolutely discussed. And usually it was in the context of energy affordability. But it was absolutely discussed. So what are some takeaways just from the last big set of elections for the climate movement? Well, currently there aren't enough climate voters to force politicians to lead on our issues. No doubt about that. Although addressing climate change is a low salience issue, it's popular. And I think this is so important to understand because anybody who has ever worked on a political campaign before knows that there are a lot of different ways to approach a winning coalition. One is see what voters care about and hope that they want to listen to what you have to say on that issue as opposed to your opponent. Another is to look for things that are like wedge issues. What are some things where voters just love what I have to say and hate what my opponent has to say? And even though they might not think those issues are more important, maybe we can make them more important. Maybe we can make more voters show up who care about those issues. What's an example of this? So many people on the news, so many pundits right now saying, oh, no one wants to talk about climate. It's not important. Voters don't think it's important. We shouldn't talk about it. And then in the next breath, they say, man, Democrats should talk about Jeffrey Epstein night and day. Everybody talks about releasing the Epstein files, and I think we should release the Epstein files. Are they a number one political priority for anybody casting their ballot? No, no, not even close. But it's a damn good wedge issue. If you can make that more salient, if you can make more people care about it even more, that's a great wedge issue. And so just because currently there aren't enough voters prioritizing climate doesn't mean we shouldn't talk about these extraordinarily popular issues. And finally, as I said, this could change, but boy, is talking about energy affordability a great way to make some connections, a great way to get popular issues, political action on climate, and tie them to politically salient issues that are top of mind for voters, which are affordability issues. And we saw that happen across so many elections. We saw moderate suburban women win on that message. We saw progressive democratic socialists win on that message. And we need to take some of that away with us. All right. I'm going to come to the close and then we'll have that optional Q&A session. The Environmental Voter Project is already back to work. We have already had thousands, literally thousands of conversations with voters for special elections and runoff elections since November 4th. As we look ahead to 2026, we haven't yet individually identified all of our targets because we want to get some more voter file data back from this recent set of elections to determine who is likely or unlikely to vote next year. But our best guess is that we're going to be targeting 5 million already registered voters in these 21 states. And all of these 5 million registered voters list climate or the environment as their top priority, yet they've never voted in a midterm election or lower turnout election before in their lives. And we're going to know them by name and street address. And we're going to be working year round to get them. So buckle up and get ready. We are going to be one of the largest, most sophisticated turnout operations in the country in 2026. And boy, are we excited to have you working with us. And if you're ready to get involved right away, this is what the next few months are going to look like. Yes, we are phone banking and delivering digital ads to voters right now. And we're going to give you some phone banks to sign up for in a second. Then we're going to begin building our target voter universes, probably in about 3 or 4 weeks. In the new year, we are going to announce the first of our postcarding campaigns. How can you sign up for that? Make sure you're on our email list. You will get an email. If you haven't been trained before, we will ask you to take one of our trainings, and then you can sign up. We're also going to be canvassing, and then we expect probably by late February or sometime into March to be able to release our randomized control trial data from 2024, because in some states it takes that long for them to update their voter files. If you're ready to jump in and get started right away, the Albuquerque mayoral runoff election. Albuquerque's a really big city, the biggest city in New Mexico, which happens to be the second largest oil producing state in the country. Yes, the second largest. This is important. We are mobilizing voters for the Albuquerque mayoral runoff. We've got phone banks on November 24th and December 2nd. There's a link to sign up for these phone banks in the chat right now. Florida House District 90 has an election coming up on December 9th. Georgia House District 121. This is one of my favorites because I think this is going to be one of those special elections that people wake up and read about in the news. In this district, Trump, I think, carried this district by 12 or 13 points. And if you look at Democrats' performance in special elections this year, usually they are overperforming 2024 by about 12 or 13 points. I don't have any inside information on House District 121, but it's the type of special election that could be pretty darn close. We're running phone banks election eve and election day for that. And then on December 30th, yes, December 30th, there's a special state Senate district election in Iowa, and we've got 2 December phone banks for that. The final call to action, that I want to make here, and this is crucially important before we get to the optional Q&A, is Giving Tuesday is coming up. It's on December 2nd, but you'll see we have down an entire week here, and here's why. A lot of people don't know this, but Giving Tuesday is the single most important fundraising day of the year for the Environmental Voter Project. It is crucially important for us meeting our annual budget, and we're on a calendar year budget. And so what we are doing is we are collecting matching pledges right now. We already have, I think, 9 or 10 donors who have pledged at least $1,000 and some many more than that, so that we can offer anybody who donates between November 25th and December 2nd this year that their donation will be doubled, that it will be matched by one of these matching donors. We don't yet know how many matching dollars we will have. That depends on how many we collect over the next 6 days. But if you are interested, please email info@environmentalvoter.org. We're going to put it in the chat, info@environmentalvoter.org. And all you need to do is write an email there saying, I pledge $1,000 for this matching campaign. I pledge $10,000 for this matching campaign. And what that will then do is encourage a whole bunch of people to donate in that week leading into Giving Tuesday. Because if we are going to kill it in the 2026 midterms, like we know that we can, we need to have a hugely successful Giving Tuesday matching campaign. We have to. So in closing, please make a Giving Tuesday matching pledge of at least $1,000. If you can't donate $1,000, that's totally fine. What you can do is mark your calendar for November 25th. And believe me, we will email you, and I want you to open up those emails, because then if you donate during that week, your donation will be doubled. It will be doubled if we get enough of these matching pledges. And please donate generously. Not for charity, not out of the goodness of your heart, but because there is no denying the critical importance of politics at this moment in time that we are living through. And we don't have all the answers at the Environmental Voter Project, but we have some of them. We have gotten incredibly good at identifying millions of values-aligned voters and getting them to the polls, and we have the receipts to prove it. And with your help, we can make an enormous impact in 2026. But we need to start by having robust mobilizations in January and February and March. And that only happens with a successful Giving Tuesday. So, thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention. And especially, thank you to all of our donors, and thank you to all of our volunteers who made our 2025 campaign so enormously successful. I know you've got to wait for voter files to be updated before we report back to you with all of our data. Believe me, we wish we had all this information too. We hate waiting for it too. We will report back to you. And if you want to be part of our matching campaign, please, again, email info@environmentalvoter.org. All you need to say is, I pledge blank amount for this matching campaign. Thank you. And I know it's been an hour. Thank you for your time. If you want to stay on for our optional Q&A, boy, would we be happy to answer all of your questions. As long as you don't expect any hot takes. This is still a no hot takes analysis. Thanks, everybody. What do we got, Shannon? What do we got?
Well, thanks for getting ahead of question 1, which was letting folks know when we will have these results for our work. Second, real quick one before some folks drop off. Everyone wants to share this information with their friends, their family. How are they going to get this? How are we sharing it out with them?
Make sure you're signed up for our email. Hopefully all of you are, because you RSVP'd for this event. We will be emailing a video of what you just saw, including this Q&A, later on this afternoon. So watch your email, open it, and share away. You can share all of this data with your friends. So watch your email. You will have it later today.
All right. Hot takes only, Nathaniel. Big
No!
questions. Just kidding. Big questions from Linda and Jake and a few other folks. So obviously people are putting together the idea that affordability is top of mind and climate has huge impacts on the economy. So do you have any thoughts about how the climate movement can like harness this affordability concern and tie it into climate, and whether you think this is a good long-term strategy or whether this is really a short-term shift in the electorate?
So let me answer the second question first, and thank you for these questions, Linda, Jake, and other folks. You should never assume that anything is a long-term shift in politics. You should always test and retest any assumption like that. Okay, now let's get to the first part of the question. What are some ways that we can tie these things in? Well, the first is it is just factually accurate that clean energy is cheaper than dirty energy. It just is. It just is. But a lot of people aren't aware of that. Or in some jurisdictions, because of utility monopolies or because of legislation requiring certain amounts of energy to be on the grid at certain periods of times, or because of certain subsidy regimes, things like that, the natural cheapness of clean energy isn't coming through. But oh my God, just pushing that realization that yes, collecting the wind that blows and collecting the sun that shines is indeed cheaper than having someone dig up decayed fossils, then transport them, then refine them, then transport them again, then have you burn them. Yes, the first part, the clean stuff, is cheaper. It is now cheaper, especially solar, but also wind and some other stuff. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing is, and this is crucially important because it gets people who care about climate and the environment out of their mindset as sort of individual consumers and more into sort of a political mindset, which is obviously important if you're trying to get someone to vote and vote a particular way. The reason fossil fuel energy is often so expensive is because fossil fuel companies have bought political protection, which, by the way, is not what you do if you are a healthy industry that has a popular product that sells itself. You don't go out and try to buy political protection, monopoly power, and huge subsidies. You only do that when you know you literally have a toxic product that kills people, that is becoming more and more expensive and is subject to the whims of dictators and war all around the world. This is also a really, really important message to push for two reasons. One, it gets people into that political mindset. It makes them realize, oh, it's because of politics that this stuff is more expensive. Not necessarily because technology hasn't caught up. The technology is there. We've got cheap, clean energy. The politics is what's holding us back. And the second reason is it paints a villain in the fossil fuel industry. And I don't say that because I think we always need to have a villain or we always need to pick fights. But let's face it, most of the climate stories we tell ourselves, we paint ourselves as the villains. We feel guilty. We feel like we've ruined this beautiful planet of ours, and if only we could change what we buy and how we act, everything would be fine again. And I'm sorry, it's not that simple. And boy, is that a hard story to sell to people. The story of, hey, you're to blame, just overcome yourself. Maybe some of you have heard me talk about this using the phrase, the climate crisis is a homicide, not a suicide. And I think, again, that framework is also really, really helpful when talking about affordability. Because the only reason our energy is so expensive is because the fossil fuel industry has bought this political protection and has so much subsidies. So those are two ideas that I have. But I do just want to say, again, Jake and Linda, really, really good questions. Changing people's minds isn't the only way to build political power for the climate movement. As we just saw in the set of elections that just happened, sometimes you don't need to change minds. Sometimes you need to find the people who are already with you, yet they're not voting, and get them to show up. And obviously, I need to bring that up because of the work we do at EVP. All right, some other questions.
Great answer. I hope that gets to folks' questions on that topic. I know that was a big one. Um, Shifting to Georgia. So I know there wasn't exit polling data for Georgia. And we similarly didn't have that comparative data because like there wasn't a PSC election, especially recently, in Georgia where we could compare the turnout numbers. But do you have any thoughts as to kind of why Democrats came out strongly ahead in this election and whether we might have seen swing voters like Trump to the Dems?
So, really, really great question.
And that's from
And
Wanda. I
Wanda,
forgot to say that came from.
awesome. Thank you, Wanda. Thank you. It's a really, really great question. I'm going to be able to answer some of it. I'm not going to be able to answer other parts of it. Let me start with what I can't answer. We just aren't going to have enough data for many months. Actually, let me revise that. We're probably never going to have enough data to tell whether there were people who changed their minds, whether there were Trump voters who voted Democrat in the Georgia election that we just had. In some other states, we might be able to tell with certainty because there's what's called voter verified polls, where once voter files are updated and we have absolute certainty that an individual voted, then we can poll them and ask them questions about how they voted and why and things like that. My guess is no one's going to be spending the money to do voter verified polling in Georgia. I might be wrong, but I don't think there will be. And so it's going to be really hard to tell whether there were switchers, whether there were mind changers, whether there were Trump voters turning Democrat in 2025 in Georgia. But, Wanda, to get to the first part of your question, there is some stuff that we can tell about turnout there. The first is, you know, although there weren't previous, I mean, there hasn't been a PSC election in Georgia for like, half a generation, but although there weren't previous statewide odd year elections in Georgia, at least higher salience ones, there are municipal elections. And when we look at Atlanta, where there was a mayoral election this year, not a really big one that was top of mind for a lot of people, but there was a mayoral election. There was 31, maybe 32% turnout, so much higher than the statewide 19% turnout. When you go back 4 years ago to the Atlanta mayoral election, which was more top of mind for people because it was more of an open election, 25% of voters voted in that Atlanta election. So what does that tell me? That tells me that the mayoral election alone, at least in Atlanta, but Atlanta is by far and away the largest city in Georgia, the mayoral election alone wasn't driving boosted levels of turnout, even in big cities. And there were other cities that had mayoral elections. Something else was going on that boosted turnout in big metro areas. It wasn't just that there was a mayoral election on the ballot. It was also either these PSC elections or grassroots organizers or GOTV organizations like the Environmental Voter Project. Because otherwise, we wouldn't expect to see turnout in Atlanta jump up to 31% where it was. We would expect it to be higher than the 19% baseline across the state, but we'd expect it to be more 23, 24, 25, not 30 or 31 or 32. So that tells me there were people who typically wouldn't vote in an off year weird PSC election, wouldn't even typically vote in a mayoral election, yet they were fired up and ready to go and they turned out. What does that mean for the midterm? I wish I could tell you with certainty. I don't think anybody can tell because, as you might remember from some of the charts that we showed you, turnout in Georgia at 19% was still way, way below what we would expect from midterm level turnout. But what I can say is that clearly Democratic voters are fired up and angry and ready to vote in Georgia right now. And I can tell you, Wanda, when voter files are updated in Georgia and we can see on an individual basis who voted, the very first thing I'm going to look at is how many people voted in this PSC election who had never voted in a midterm election before. There's a decent number of those people, and we will be able to tell that. That's going to be really telling. That's going to be really, really interesting because that will be an indication of brand new voters who are fired up and politicized in a way that we haven't seen before in Georgia. But we don't have that data yet, but we will. We will have that data.
All right. So next question is from Patrick. I think differently from what we saw in New Jersey and in Georgia, where the candidates talked a lot about climate. That did not seem to be the case in Virginia. So Spanberger really didn't talk about climate much in her campaign. So what do you think that means for environmental voters there?
It's a great question. It's really hard to read into something that didn't happen, Patrick. Let's be honest, okay? My job here is not to be a pundit who sounds smart. My job here is to try to be smart, and sometimes that means admitting a lot of what we don't know. But I think one thing is pretty clear, and that is a what seemed like extraordinarily smart campaign that won by an enormous amount decided not to talk about an issue that when we look at all the polling data, surprise, surprise, not many voters list as a top priority. And so even though I run an environmental nonprofit, I don't think there is any evidence that shows, oh, Spanberger made a mistake. She really should have talked about climate more. No. And I know this isn't what a lot of people want to hear. But listen, all of us, not just those of us who run nonprofits, but all of us in the climate movement are in the problem solving business. We are in the problem solving business. And one of the biggest problems we have to solve right now is that the climate movement doesn't have enough political power. And when you are a politician, and when you are running a campaign that is trying to win 50% plus one of the votes on a Tuesday in November, you have a limited time and limited money and limited bandwidth to communicate with voters. You can't talk about everything. And I take what just happened in Virginia, because you're right, Patrick. From everything that I can tell, the Spanberger campaign did not talk much about climate. What I take from that is that they probably made an informed decision that their best issues also happen to be high salience issues, and so they could talk about affordability and other things and not necessarily talk about climate or even energy affordability, even though energy affordability was in play in Georgia, although that was a public service commission race, so that's more understandable. Or it was the case in New Jersey. And I think an interesting point of evidence for this, Patrick, is another one of the elections that happened. New York City. I mean, Zoran Mamdani, throughout his political career, it's not a long political career, but throughout his political career, has talked a lot about climate. He's talked a lot about a Green New Deal. He is never afraid of leaning into addressing climate change. And I have never, and I've been in politics for a pretty long time, I don't think I have ever seen someone with as much message discipline as Zoran Mamdani had. You could ask him what his favorite toothpaste is, and he would be talking about affordability within 2 seconds. When someone like that, who again, like has plenty of feelings, has plenty of opinions about climate change, decides to not talk about climate change, that means something to me. It means he was looking at the electorate, and some really smart people were looking at the electorate and deciding, we should be talking about this thing instead. And I know that's not what a lot of you want to hear. You probably want to hear me say, oh, all those people are stupid. They should have talked about climate and things would have gone better. No, I think they're smart. And I think what they're realizing is that the climate movement doesn't have enough political power. And so it's up to us to get that power and get it fast if we're ever going to force politicians to lead on climate. We can do that through turnout, and we can do that through message tweaks and some of the persuasion and some of the discussion of energy affordability. But it's a really, really good question, Patrick, that gets at a really difficult issue.
I think we have time for two more questions.
All right.
So one, and I know this is something we usually dive into with like our impact results webinars, but for those that are already planning their own involvement for 2026, could you give some advice as to the like relative value of our different voter mobilization tools, postcards, phone bank, mailers, digital, things like that?
Great, great questions. Okay. So the Environmental Voter Project, because we target individuals, we only mobilize people who can, with communications methods that can be targeted individually. So what that means is we mobilize voters using 5 methods. First, door-to-door canvassing, so volunteers going door to door. Second, volunteer phone calls. Third, volunteer postcards. So those are the 3 of the methods that volunteers are involved with. Then, as a staff, we run direct mail campaigns and digital ad campaigns. So those are the 5 methods we're going to discuss the relative value of here. The second thing, and I promise I'll answer your question, but this is the no hot takes, super nerdy analysis, so we've got to have a lot of caveats here. The second thing is we think about value in 2 ways. One is effectiveness, the other is efficiency. So what do I mean by those in this context? Effectiveness is what is the greatest we can expect to boost turnout per contact made with something? So if you knock on a voter's door and have a conversation with them, how much can you expect to maybe boost turnout over a control group with that contact? And compare that to a phone conversation or someone getting a postcard or someone seeing a digital ad. That's effectiveness. Efficiency is effectiveness over time or effectiveness over money spent. So maybe I can really boost turnout through door-to-door canvassing, but if I knock on doors for 3 hours, maybe I can only have 10 conversations. So it's a lower in efficiency than it is effectiveness. Or maybe it takes me 10 hours to write postcards. So the efficiency is different from the effectiveness. All right. I promise I'm done with all the caveats, but I want you to know how we think about all these interventions. First, let me talk about effectiveness. The most effective way to boost turnout is one human being talking to another human being in real life at their door. It's old fashioned, but it works. Knocking on doors and talking to people still has the highest ceiling for boosting turnout. Currently, we are doing, and when we look ahead to 2026, we're doing door to door canvassing campaigns in Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Northeastern Virginia, and we may be doing them at the Atlanta area. It depends on volunteer interest. After door to door canvassing, usually comes direct mail, then volunteer postcards, digital ads, and phone banks. But all of those, even phone banks, can increase turnout well above 1 percentage point. And there have been phone banking campaigns where we've increased turnout 2.5 percentage points, usually in lower turnout elections. But like 2.5% is a lot. Ask Kamala Harris how big a deal 2.5% is in this game. It's a big, big deal. All right. Now let's talk about efficiency. Many of you have written postcards before. You don't need me to tell you how long it takes to write 200 postcards. Good postcard campaigns can boost turnout 1.1, 1.2, maybe even 1.5 percentage points over a control group. But you need to take that with a huge grain of salt that often it will take someone 10 hours to write enough postcards to contact 200 voters. And so what that means is in 10 hours, you are bringing 3 new voters off the sidelines who otherwise wouldn't have showed up. Is that worth it? You're damn right it's worth it. You're damn right it's worth it. But over 10 hours of phone banking, you might be able to talk to 500 people, 600 people. And that could bring 6, 7, 8 voters off the sidelines who otherwise wouldn't have voted. And we can prove that in randomized control trials. And so it really is a mix of what do you feel most comfortable doing and what is the best use of your time. I can assure you this, though. There are very few organizations who run randomized control trials. A lot of them ask you to write postcards or make calls or write letters, either never having tested whether they actually increase turnout, or they have tested it and they haven't gotten what's called statistically significant results, which means they can't prove that that increase in turnout wasn't due to just random chance. At the Environmental Voter Project, we are very fortunate that we are now at a place where we have so many, well over 300 randomized control trials under our belts, that Shannon, our field and organizing director, never has to ask a volunteer to do anything without being able to look them in the eyes and say, this script that we're giving you, or this postcard design that we're giving you, we have proven in statistically significant randomized control trials that it increases turnout over a control group. We are very proud to be able to say that to you. So we can tell you that anything we give you has been proven to work in the past. Now the only determination is, do you as a volunteer want to spend your time doing it? Is it an efficient use of your time? And if you're someone who cares about democracy and cares about climate, I'm not sure there's anything better you could be doing with your time in 2026 than turning non-voters into new voters. So we really, really do want you to join us. And I know that Shannon just put a link in the chat for you to sign up for these volunteer efforts. Okay, I can't believe we have so many people who have stayed now for almost an hour and a half. Dear God. Okay, Shannon, I know you mentioned we had one more question. What do we got as our final question here?
All right. Looking at 2026, what are the top few races that you think EVP is going to make a difference on that are a little under the radar right now?
Oh, okay. I like this question. Okay, so I'm not going to mention any of the things, any of the places where we're working that you guys are probably already aware of, right? We already know that, like, North Carolina and Maine and Georgia and Michigan, these are all going to be really important US Senate races and things like that. There's going to be important gubernatorials, tight gubernatorials in Michigan and Arizona and elsewhere. Not going to mention those. I am going to mention some under the radar stuff. Okay. The first under the radar election, and it is also first chronologically, Virginia is likely going to pull a California, and they are going to have a constitutional amendment referendum to enable them to redraw their congressional districts. We won't yet know until probably the second week of January if and when this election will happen. But it's looking like it definitely will happen, and it will most likely happen in April. So let me give the much shorter answer to this. In April, there will be a statewide referendum in Virginia, almost definitely, where Virginians will be voting on whether to probably give Democrats two, maybe three more congressional seats in next year's midterms. That's going to be an important election. And boy, is EVP going to be getting involved, and boy, are we going to want our volunteers and our donors involved. That's a crucially important below the radar election. Some other below the radar elections where EVP will be getting involved, but might not be getting all the headlines yet. Alaska. Alaska is a sneakily close state. I know a lot of people, when they're thinking about control of the Senate, think about, well, Maine is going to be important and North Carolina is going to be important, but then, if Democrats regain control of the Senate, then it's going to depend on some redder states like Texas or Ohio or maybe Florida, maybe Nebraska. Alaska rarely gets mentioned. Alaska, I believe, maybe I'm wrong in mentioning this, was closer than Texas or as close as Texas in the presidential election last year. Alaska can be very, very close. Mary Peltola won a race for their at-large U.S. House seat 3 years ago. Now, she lost it a year ago, but she is thinking very seriously about either running for U.S. Senate in Alaska or running for governor. And I think Alaska is going to be one of those places where their one at-large House seat, their gubernatorial election, and their U.S. Senate race could end up not just being close, but being determinative. It's going to be really, really important. And boy, are there a lot of non-voting environmentalists in Alaska. And EVP is not just going to be working there for the primary in August and the general in November, but literally half the state lives in Anchorage, and Anchorage has municipal elections the first Tuesday in April. So we're going to be mobilizing voters there. And that's often the easiest, cheapest way to turn non-voters into new voters and make sure that they vote in the midterms. Okay, the final below the radar state that I'll bring up is Iowa. Iowa has oddly close and competitive House districts. There is a chance that 2 out of Iowa's 4 congressional districts, and maybe even 3 out of the 4, are going to be like truly competitive US House races. And I, I don't see how the US House is not super close again next November. I mean, any state that potentially has 3 competitive US House races is going to be crucially important. Crucially important. I mean, with their redistricting, California might end up only having like 3 competitive US House. I mean, they'll probably have a few more than that, but like Iowa's going to be sneakily important. So those are the three under the radar important places for 2026 that EBP is going to be working. Virginia, Iowa, and Alaska. All right. I cannot believe, my God, we have so many people still on the line. Thank you all for your time, for your attention. Thank you for all of your questions. And I'll close just by thanking you for two more things. One, again, thank you all so much for being part of our efforts in 2025. So many of you donated generously. So many of you gave of your time and expertise and energy as volunteers. And believe me, I wish we could have updated voter files like that. I'm so sorry we have to wait for them. But I promise you, we're going to give you the best gift any activist could ever ask for. And that is a really detailed write up of the impact that you have. We are going to let you know the results of all of these randomized control trials once we get this data. And the final thing that I want to say is, again, please keep Giving Tuesday in mind. 50 million, well over 50 million Americans are likely going to donate to their favorite nonprofits in 13 days. Please include the Environmental Voter Project among them. And if you donate in that week leading into Giving Tuesday, we hope that all of you will be able to have your donation matched. It will depend on how many matching pledges we get. So please do one of two things. One, either email info@environmentalvoter.org right now and say, I pledge to match $1,000 of donations during that week, or 5,000 or 10,000. You don't need to make the donation. I'll just write you back an email and say, thank you so much. That's so generous of you. I'll report back to you to let you know how much we raised and how much of that match we unlocked. If you're not able to do a matching pledge, please mark your calendars for November 25th to December 2nd and donate generously, because we got a lot of work to do in 2026. And we're ready to make an enormous, enormous impact. All right. Thanks, everybody. Bye bye.